Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Life of the Emperor Francis Joseph by Francis Gribble. Chapter 23.
John Orth, as we shall have to call him, was the Archduke John Salvator, the brother of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the uncle of the Archduke who was to become Herr Wulfling, and of the princess who was to marry Signor Toselli. This is the branch of the House of Habsburg which has been most conspicuous in its revolt against the Habsburg traditions, and the Archduke John Salvator's place among them is that of the first of the family rebels. He was not only a rebel in love, he also caused trouble and got into trouble as soldier and politician. He was a man of many accomplishments, one who fancied himself not only as a soldier and a sailor and a pamphleteer, but also as a musical composer. He composed a waltz which enjoyed a great vogue not only in Vienna, and then, suspecting that its popularity might be due to his rank, he decided to compose something more ambitious and produce it anonymously. The great work was a ballet, Les Assassins, which was duly staged at the Vienna Opera as the production of a new and unknown man. Its anonymity would not have impaired its prospects if the Vienna Opera had had a press agent who knew his business as the modern press agents know theirs. Dark hints, mysteriously whispered, would then have stimulated the curiosity of the public and invited the applause of the connoisseurs and leaders of opinion. But the press agents did not know their business. Perhaps there were no press agents in those days. And the ballet itself, though pretty good for an archduke, did not come up to the standard of professional musicians. Its reception was chilly, and its run was short. So the Archduke John Salvator turned his activity into other channels. While little more than a boy, he became a military critic and a political agitator, publishing his first pamphlet on the organization of the Austrian army when he was no more than 21. The gist of his remarks was that the Austrian military system had got into a rut and that the Austrian artillery was defective. Incidentally, too, he criticized the conduct of the Austrian Foreign Office, and the foreign minister made representations, with the result that the Archduke was sent to Krakow to be out of the way. In his exile, however, he wrote more pamphlets, setting forth that the frontier fortifications were valueless and that the war minister did not know his business. He also lectured at the military club on the Austrian system of military education, which he declared to be wooden and to deprive the soldiers of all initiative and resource. That lecture was a veiled attack upon the Archduke Albert, the victor of Custoza. So the Archduke John Salvator was once more politely exiled, this time to a command at Linz. Decidedly, this Archduke was Fronder, with inclinations towards liberalism, and there were precedents for those inclinations in his family. He was the grandson of that Grand Duke of Tuscany who put an end to the Inquisition in his dominions, and an ancestor of his had been the first legitimate potentate to recognize the French Republic after the Revolution. Nothing was more natural, therefore, than that he should have a good word to say for the Austrian rebels of 1848, though it was inevitable that his praise of them should shock conservative circles. So he sulked at Linz, while officialdom sulked at Vienna, and there was further commotion when he posed his candidature, without asking the emperor's leave, for the vacant throne of Bulgaria. The crown prince was sent to him to inform him that he had incurred Francis Joseph's displeasure, and he was stripped even of his rights over his own regiment of artillery. If he and Rudolph did, as Countess Marie Larisch suggests, put their heads together and talk about a coup d'etat and the usurpation of the throne of Hungary, that punishment may well have furnished the starting point of their treasonable confabulations. The two archdukes were close friends and kindred spirits. Among other enterprises, they had combined to expose the spiritualistic medium, Harry Bastian, to the horror and disgust of the superstitious sections of Viennese society. Moreover, the Archduke John Salvator may be supposed to have sympathized with Rudolph's love affairs, for he had, as we are about to see, a very similar love affair of his own. These facts no doubt furnish a prelude, more or less fitting, to his appearance in Countess Marie Larisch's narrative as the mysterious stranger to whom she handed Rudolph's steel casket of compromising documents. And if Countess Marie's recollection of what he said to her on that occasion is correct, he was himself the principal person whom those documents might have compromised. "Never mind," she reports him as saying. "Things have happened for the best. You could not save a coward like Rudolph, but you've saved my life." And he added that he was going to die without dying because he was tired of the hollow things of life. And her comment is, "Has he died without dying? I think so. And I believe that the Archduke, despite all evidence to the contrary, will return in his own good time." Unquote. And Princess Louisa of Tuscany, it is to be noted, says pretty much the same. To her also, and to her brother Leopold, the Archduke John Salvator announced his intentions. "I am about to disappear, my dear children, and I shall do so in such a manner that no one will ever find me. When the emperor is dead, I will return, for then Austria will require my services." And her comment is, "Papa was convinced to the day of his death that his brother was alive, and as time proves all things, the emperor's death will perhaps solve the mystery, for Austria may then require the services of John Orth in the international complications which will no doubt follow." Unquote. But all that is mere conjecture, and the conjectures belong to a later stage of the story. The solid fact to be set down here is that the Archduke John Salvator, having received the signification of Francis Joseph's displeasure, sought and obtained Francis Joseph's permission to quit the Austrian army and retired to live quietly at his castle of Orth on the shores of the Lake of Munden. But his position and aspirations had, meanwhile, been complicated by a love affair with a fascinating nymph of the ballet. It was not his first love affair. The woman who first taught the Archduke John Salvator to love was English. He met her when he was only a lieutenant of hussars on an Austrian Lloyd steamer in the course of a journey from Port Said to Trieste. One of his letters to her has got into the hands of those who collect such things. And it shows us the Archduke already cherishing the dream, dreamt by so many Habsburgs, of flying from pomp in order to indulge an honorable passion, and proving himself as capable as any meaner man of supporting a family by honest toil. It will be seen that he expresses his contempt for his illustrious title by a pretty play upon words. This is the communication, quote, "Most darlingest of angel girls, I must lavish on you terms of endearment. You are my loveliest love, mia cara carissima, ma petite chérie, my own sweet rose of Kent. I thought myself often in love before I had the happiness to meet you, but was mistaken. You fill my soul as nobody else has ever done. I am in despair at being told I must not pay you further attention. My imperial rank stands in the way, say you and your honored mother, of courtship pour le bon motif. It should. Did I not realize the utter vanity of being penned up with a tribe of 70 relatives on an isolated peak? I hate my position, and am determined to live as a man should, and not like a poor creature who must be spoon-fed from the cradle to the grave. It depends on you whether I shall go on as an arch-duckling or not. You spoke of the sad life of Penny Smith. Yes, it was a sad one, but why? The Prince of Capua had not the manliness to go and work for a living for himself and his wife. My courage is equal to emigrating to Australia, where I am sure I should fall on my feet. I could be a manager of a theater, a teacher of French, German, Italian, or the curator of a zoo or a botanical garden, or I could be a riding master or a stock rider. Without going so far as Australia, I might get married in Italy to the girl of my choice. I was born a Tuscan, and the statutes of the Grand Ducal family are dead letters there. As you can never be an archduchess, I shall be only too happy to cease to be an archduke, but hope ever to be counted your darling archduckling Johann. Or, since you like my soft Italian name, Giovanni, but not on any account Don Juan." Unquote. It is, in very truth, a remarkable document. But it is the sort of document which never surprises one when emanating from a Habsburg pen, and perhaps ought not to surprise one when emanating from any royal or imperial pen. In the House of Habsburg, as in many other royal and imperial houses, and notably those of the Wittelsbachs and the Neapolitan Bourbons, we find many men and women who have combined great ardor in love with a passionate desire for the domestic tranquility of the common lot and the lives of obscure citizens of the middle classes. Examples which occur on the spur of the moment are those of Queen Christina of Spain, who married ex-Private Munoz, the son of a Madrid tobacconist, and played parlor games in the palace with that tobacconist and his family. Of Queen Christina's sister, the Duchesse de Berry, who married and seconds noses, the impecunious young diplomat, Lucchesi Pali, and bore him innumerable children. Of that Archduke John, who was united so happily to the daughter of the village postmaster. Of that Archduke Henry, whose wife, Leopoldine Hoffmann, the actress, was created Countess of Waldeck. Such were the exemplars, though one could name many more, whose temperament and tastes the Archduke John Salvator shared. But his advances, as both the letter and the sequel show, did not this time inspire confidence. The lady, it seems, did not love him for himself alone, saw no beauty in the prospect of becoming the bride of a teacher of languages, or a writing master, or the curator of the zoological gardens at Sydney or Melbourne. And perhaps she was, from the worldly point of view, wise. Habsburgs who are ready to turn their hands to anything have sometimes had to turn their hands to very menial occupations. Within the last few years, an appeal was made to Francis Joseph to do something for a Habsburg, a descendant of the Archduke Ernest, who had fallen, or risen, to be head waiter in a cafe at Budapest. The lady whom the Archduke John Salvator had once proposed to support in modest comfort by means of honest toil, may since perhaps have heard of that incident with curiously mixed emotions. At all events, she did not marry the Archduke, her mother, as appears from the letter, intervening, and he, on his part, did not keep single for her sake, or at all events did not keep unattached. Princess Louisa tells us that he wanted to marry her, his niece, the future bride of Signor Tasselli. But that is as it may be. His desire to do so was, at any rate, kept under control. One thinks of him rather as one of those Habsburgs whom the bare idea of consanguineous marriage revolts, and one knows that he met his fate, in a sentimental sense, while shooting with some of his brother officers in the Semmering district. One cannot do better than borrow the poetical picture of the scene presented to us by his biographer. Madame de Faucigny-Lusange, quote, "It was one of those moments when the human soul feels the need of fusion and communion with the mysteries of nature." The prince was walking in a favorite path of his, a discreet refuge in which his companions had always been accustomed to leave him alone. Of a sudden, he found himself in the presence of a girl whose delicate features and pensive gaze attracted his attention. Her eyes were gentle, and her lips were lighted with a smile. As he overheard her talking with her parents, it seemed to the Archduke that he had long been familiar with that melodious voice, so fraught with enchantment to all who listened to it. For the things which most delight us always seem like reminiscences of some previous life. Unquote. Nothing happened, however, at the moment. The Archduke passed by without speaking. Too shy to speak, perhaps, though that, in the light of the letter which we have just read, is not very easy to believe, but he did not forget. To quote the same narrator, his thoughts came back, again and again, to the girl who had appeared to him in such poetical circumstances in an autumn twilight. He wanted to know who she was, and having learnt that her home was in Vienna, where she lived with her parents, and that her name was Millie Stubel, and that she was one of the artistas employed at the opera, he sought and found an opportunity of meeting her again. Every time that he met her, it was a fresh pleasure to him to remark the originality and the attractive complexity of her gifted nature. Soon they were passing long hours in each other's society, and it was the unspeakable joy of musical harmony which attached him for evermore to Millie, for music is far more eloquent than words. Unquote. One has no difficulty in believing it, for that is what the Habsburgs are like. One after another, they find their way to the common lot by taking a perfectly sincere and simple interest in the ordinary occupations and amusements of ordinary people. Sometimes those interests are domestic, as in the case of the Archduke Charles Ferdinand, who is said to have proposed marriage in the kitchen. They sometimes are artistic, as in the case of Princess Louisa of Tuscany, who was at the piano when she first spoke of love to Signor Tasselli. So that it was quite in conformity with the family traits that the Archduke John Salvator should forget his rank in order to talk musical criticism with the ballet girl. And it was equally in accordance with the family traits that the talk should soon become affectionately intimate. They talked of marriage, to the Austrian ballet girl, as to the English lady. The Archduke spoke of his ability to earn a competence by the sweat of his brow, not this time as a teacher of languages or a keeper of wild beasts, but as a skipper in the merchant service. In a sense, it was idle talk, for he had money enough in the bank to keep both himself and a wife in comfort. But he wanted the common lot, and labor, as well as matrimony, was a part of it. Nor was he making an empty boast, for he had passed the tests and held a master mariner's certificate. That was the condition of things with him when, not long after the Meyerling tragedy, he had his final quarrel with Francis Joseph. The ultimate grounds and the immediate occasion of that quarrel remain uncertain. From Countess Marie Lariche's narrative, one would gather that, whatever the proximate cause may have been, the final cause was the Hungarian plot. Princess Louisa, on the other hand, has a story that Francis Joseph ordered him to apologize for language which he had used to the Archduke Albert, and that he refused to do so. Both stories may be true, and the Archduke's determination to marry an opera nymph may also have been a contributory cause of disagreement. The actual scene is described by Princess Louisa, who may be supposed to have had her information from the Archduke himself. Quote, "Uncle John," she tells us, said in his bold way that he would leave the army and the court rather than be dictated to, and he concluded by declaring that he did not care in the least whether he was a member of the Imperial house. A storm followed this rank apostasy, and my uncle, in a fit of ungovernable rage, tore off his Order of the Golden Fleece and flung it at the emperor. Unquote. The emperor, as may be supposed, was not melted, but rather hardened by that appeal to his feelings, so that, when the Archduke presently announced his desire to resign his rank and titles, take the name of John Orth, and leave Austria, Francis Joseph replied that he might take any name he chose and go where he liked, but that, if he ever attempted to return, he would find that the Austrian police had orders to arrest him as soon as he crossed the frontier. Those were the circumstances in which he departed, and Millie Stubble departed with him. He could not marry her in Austria, but he had promised to marry her in London.
Chapter 24.
We will now definitely call John of Tuscany John Orth. But a cloud of uncertainty overhangs both his assumption of that name and his subsequent adventures. Ostensibly, he assumed the name and shook the dust of Austria off his feet to please himself. But there are not wanting those who declare that, if he had not resigned his rank, he would have been deprived of it, and that he only banished himself because the emperor had threatened to banish him. The narrative of Princess Louisa does not help us much. Princess Louisa only knows what her uncle told her, and he evidently told her very little. It is reasonable to trust her for the passionate scene in Francis Joseph's cabinet, but that is all. She was only a girl of 20 when she heard of it, and there was no reason why the hidden causes of the scene should be confided to her. Nor does one get much light from Countess Marie Lariche's story of the plot to seize the throne of Hungary, if one accepts her version of that story. For, if all the evidence relating to that plot was contained in the mysterious steel casket, then Francis Joseph would have known nothing of it, and John Orth would have had nothing to fear when once the casket was in his hands. But was all the evidence of that plot contained in that steel casket? Had not a portion of it found its way by some means or other into the hands of the Austrian secret police? That is our problem, and it will be useful to turn back to the half-forgotten gossip of the time and see if we can find in it any indications that Countess Marie Lariche's revelation has at least something in it. We can. It was assumed by Countess Marie's reviewers, when her book appeared, that her story connecting John Orth's departure with the Meyerling tragedy was, whether true or not, at all events quite new. But that assumption was erroneous. Countess Marie was only putting the dots on the I's, whether she put the right dots on the right I's or not, of a contemporaneous rumor. One may find the rumor in a work entitled The Private Life of Two Emperors, William II of Germany and Francis Joseph of Austria, published in the United States 9 years ago and written, as the publisher's note states, as far back as 1899. It possesses no sort of authority. One dares not go to it for inside information, but it does reflect, for what it is worth, the gossip of the hour. This is what the writer says. There is, it may be added also, a story as to the Archduke's disappearance which I have never yet seen in print. It connects his exile and his disappearance from the ranks of the members of the imperial family of Austria with the tragedy of Meierling and the death of Crown Prince Rudolf. It is difficult to account for the origin thereof, except for the fact which I have just mentioned, that the two archdukes had already once quarreled and had been prevented from fighting a duel only by the intervention of the emperor. There could, therefore, be no longer any love lost between them. Moreover, Archduke Rudolf died at Meierling in the early part of 1889. Archduke John left Austria and relinquished his military and imperial dignities during that same year, after having been suspended from his divisional command just about the time of the tragedy at Meierling. Unquote. What is important here is the rumor itself. The inferences drawn from it by the writer do not matter. The suggestion that John Orth was directly concerned with Rudolph's death is obviously no more than a conjectural explanation of the rumor. How, people were evidently asking themselves, could John Orth's departure be associated with Rudolph's death, except on the assumption that he had done or procured a deed of violence? Countess Marie's story at least accounts for the association without invoking that hypothesis, and it also accounts for the quarrel between the two archdukes. It was a quarrel, according to her, between conspirators, the one eager to press forward and the other frightened into wishing to hang back. And though one gathers from one page of Countess Marie's book that the secret of the conspiracy was locked up in the steel casket, one reads on another page that the ministers had an inkling of it. That fact transpires in her account of her interview with Count Julius Andrassy. Count Andrassy, she writes, said plainly that something beyond a love drama was responsible for the tragedy. The Archduke John corroborated this statement, and the affair of the steel box makes me absolutely certain of it. Unquote. Count Andrassy, that is to say, knew something, but did not choose to tell Countess Marie how much he knew. What was known to him was presumably known to the emperor too, and their joint knowledge may have been enough to induce them to drive John Orth into exile with menaces. Still, though the conjecture is plausible, certainty is unattainable. Nor is certainty attainable with regard to John Orth's alleged marriage to the ballet girl, Millie Stubble. The stock statement is to the effect that he married her in London. But none of those who make the statement have seen the marriage lines. They have been sought for, but the search has been unavailing. One suspects that a ceremony of some sort was performed somewhere, pour acquit de conscience, but that it was a ceremony without legal value. One only gets back to certainty when one comes to speak of John Orth's voyage to the New World, whither he set sail on his own ship, the Sainte Marguerite, on March 26, 1890. But he had passed by way of Switzerland, and it was while he was in Switzerland that he and Francis Joseph exchanged their last communications. That story has been told in the Berliner Tagblatt by Marshal Zanades, at that time attached to the emperor's military cabinet. Quote, John Orth, Marshal Zanades wrote, had hardly left the empire for Switzerland when the emperor instructed me to follow him, to deliver a letter to him, and to induce him to return to Vienna. I fulfilled my mission, but I could not influence the Archduke. He told me that he wished to live on his private means in accordance with his tastes. He said that he had a capital sum of 70,000 florins and proposed to lay it out to the best advantage. Seeing that he would not listen to my arguments, I took Francis Joseph's letter from my pocket and handed it to him. He ran his eyes over it and turned pale. Trembling with emotion, he handed the letter back to me and pointed to a passage in which the emperor told him that his renunciation of the title of Archduke was accepted, but that he must never set foot in Austria-Hungary again. My mission was terminated. I returned to Vienna. I told the emperor its result and informed him of the details of my conversation with the Archduke. The emperor made no remark. Unquote. It seems a little confused. The bearer of a letter forbidding John Orth to return to Austria can hardly have been instructed to try to persuade him to return there, so one sense inaccuracy. All that is established is that there were negotiations of some sort, even after John Orth had passed the frontier. We must make what we can of that imperfect information, and we must also make what we can, which is not much, of the letters in which John Orth himself bade his friends farewell. In a letter written to Herr Heinrich on December 8, 1889, we find him protesting against constructions which have been placed upon his conduct. Quote, "I give you my word of honor," he writes, "that my relations with our illustrious and benevolent sovereign have undergone no change. The impossibility of my return to the army must not, any more than my own resolution, be attributed to him." Francis Joseph's behavior in the matter has been that of a magnanimous, just, and noble monarch. I have received from the hands of Monsieur Sanadez of the military chancellery the letter granting my request, but that letter forbade me to return to my own country without special permission. Hard as I find that condition, I recognize that it is not an act of excessive or exaggerated severity. No dynasty can allow one of its members to live the life of a bourgeois in his own country without his emperor's leave. What really troubled me was the order intimated to me by the order of the minister of the Imperial household to get myself naturalized in Switzerland. What a cruel dilemma was that. On the one hand, I should have liked to demonstrate my gratitude and affection to the emperor by acting in accordance with his wishes. On the other hand, I was anxious to continue to be his subject, partly on account of my admiration for his august person, and partly on account of my passionate desire to continue to be a citizen of my beloved fatherland. I made an appeal, therefore, to the emperor's gracious kindness, and I have been a whole month without a reply letting me know whether I am or am not to be permitted to be an Austrian. Unquote. The letter, which was published, was obviously written for publication. It was a manifesto rather than a confidence, designed to tell Austria not the truth, but what John Orth wished to be accepted as the truth. We seem to see the writer laying his hand upon his heart and bowing as he makes his exit speech. He goes on to speak of his intention to obtain a master mariner's certificate, and then he becomes poetically vague, quote, "My longings and my dreams will doubtless disappear among the ocean waves. Not so the ideal which I cherish in my heart. Shall I be happy? I do not know, but at least I am satisfied that I have no reason to blush for anything that I have done. What will become of me if I do adopt the Swiss nationality? That, too, I do not know. The time for idle and empty dreams is past. Need I add that, even if I have to become Swiss, my heart and soul will continue to be entirely Austrian." Perhaps my words are the outcome of morbid excitement. However that may be, I hide my thoughts from no one, and cling to the hope that someday I shall be able to seal my fidelity to my country by my actions. In truth, my impatience to do so is great, especially great in view of the impossibility of bringing my plans to realization. Unquote. There are also a few later letters. In one of them, written on the eve of departure, we read, "Today I bid farewell to Europe, the quarter of the globe in which the first years of my life have been passed. And I am now beginning to realize in the shadow of my old flag my project of a voyage to the New World. The tug which awaits me will slowly and silently tow my ship out to sea, without any firing of salutes, and so we shall float down the Thames, the golden Thames, and in a few hours' time we shall be unfurling our sails in the midst of fog and rain." Unquote. The last letter is written after the arrival in South America. "Once away from Vienna, I find everything peaceful. My loyalty to my fatherland cannot be shaken. Across the wide waters, I waft it a salute." Unquote. That is the final gesture, and one can get little out of it beyond the fact that John Orth was a true Habsburg who must needs strike an attitude. His exit speeches to Herr Heinrich are mutatis mutandis, in the same tone as his exit speeches to Countess Marie Larisch and Princess Louisa. We have already given a portion of his farewell speech to the latter, and the rest of it may be quoted here. "My uncle looked at us tenderly, for we were on the verge of tears at the idea of losing our kind and brilliant kinsman, and he then said, with calm gravity, 'I am about to disappear, my dear children, and I shall do so in such a manner that no one will ever find me. When the emperor is dead, I will return, for then Austria will require my services. I wish, Louisa and Leopold, that you could come with me, for we three should live the life best suited to us. It cannot be, however, and our ways must part here. You are both, like myself, individualities, and, like me, you will work out your destinies. But we shall become forces that will eventually be felt." Unquote. One suspects here, of course, that Princess Louisa's self-consciousness has impaired the exactitude of her recollections. She wants us to believe that the seal of mystery was imprinted at an early age on her own brow, and that the man of mystery among the Habsburgs recognized her, even in her childhood, as a kindred spirit. Perhaps he did, and perhaps he did not. It matters very little. What really matters is the impression which John Orth left behind him. The impression of a man with dark secrets and deep designs, which he hinted at but would not communicate. One who meant to evaporate like a subtle essence, to be materialized again when there once more was work for him to do in the flesh. That was how he impressed Countess Marie Larisch when he kissed her hand and left her standing alone on that dark night in the ring. Quote, "I watched John of Tuscany as he passed into the fog and disappeared in the gloom of the night. And when I read later that he had been drowned at sea, I thought of that evening in Vienna when he bade me farewell. Has he died without dying? I think so. And I believe that the Archduke, despite all evidence to the contrary, will return in his own good time." Unquote. But what became of him? The actual known facts are very few. The Sainte Marguerite navigated not, as Princess Louisa says, by John Orth, but by Captain Sodich, set sail on March 26, 1890, and duly reached La Plata. There she took a fresh crew and started, with John Orth himself in command and Millie Stubble on board, on a voyage to Valparaiso. Furious gales were raging round the Horn at the time of her passage, and she never reached her destination. The presumption that she had gone down, with her captain and all hands, was very strong. But still hope was not abandoned. There was just a chance that she might have been wrecked on one of the desolate islands off the coast of Chile, islands which have no harbors and no means of communication with the rest of the world. The thing had happened to other ships, and it was just possible that it might have happened to the Sainte Marguerite. So Don Agostino Arroyo, minister of the Argentine Republic at Vienna, argued. And Francis Joseph sent an Austrian cruiser to search the coast in accordance with his suggestions. But without result, the cruiser searched diligently and found nothing. The sea guarded its secret, and the mystery was as deep as ever. And then legend got to work and refused to be stifled, alleging that John Orth was still alive. There were those who declared that the Sainte Marguerite had not been lost at sea, but had been given another name, and had either been marooned or entered another port than that for which she was cleared. But that is quite incredible, if not materially impossible. The ship could hardly have been marooned anywhere where she would not, by this time, have been found, and one can imagine no means whereby the silence of the survivors could have been secured. Moreover, the police of the seas and the ports does its work very effectively, and every sailor man is a potential detective who boasts that he can recognize any ship known to him without needing to read the name painted on her stern. This first theory, therefore, will not by any means hold water, and it was quickly supplanted by the second theory that, though the Sainte Marguerite was lost, with all hands, John Orth was not on board of her. That is the theory to which Princess Louisa adheres. The chief officer of this vessel, she writes, came to Salzburg expressly to see Papa, and this man told me he was positive. John Orth was alive and had never gone to Valparaiso. He described how, as the old crew stood watching the Margarita disappear into the evening mists, the person who stood on the bridge, enveloped in a great coat and muffled to the eyes, was not John Orth, but someone impersonating him. The crew in question returned to Trieste, and one and all believed the evidence of their own eyes at La Plata, and refused to put any credence in the report that their captain had been drowned at sea. Unquote. That was the starting point of the legend, and it was soon embroidered, as such legends always are. From this, that, and the other source came reports that this, that, and the other traveler had met John Orth and recognized him. One may as well make out a list of these stories. 1. A visitor to a Spanish convent recognized John Orth there in the garb of a monk. 2. A French immigrant to the Argentine Republic, returning to France in 1893, declared that he had met John Orth at Buenos Aires and again at Rio Cuarto. 3. A citizen of Trieste claimed to have met John Orth at Buenos Aires in 1894. 4. An explorer of the polar regions related that he had encountered John Orth in the midst of the eternal snow and ice, carrying a pocketbook on which the arms of the House of Habsburg were emblazoned in gold. 5. An explorer of the Chaco discovered John Orth living in a lonely hut, 16 miles from the nearest house, in the disputed territory close to the Chilean frontier. The man, who spoke German, called himself Frederick Otten, but the traveler was not to be deceived by his false name. Some of these stories are more plausible than others, and the one of them which has stuck in the minds of men is that which identifies John Orth with Frederick Otten, or as some versions of the story style him, Baron Ott. But another story, never before printed, may be added here. A gentleman who spoke English fluently with a German accent was in England a little while ago, attended by a well-known London solicitor, and prepared to negotiate with publishers. The solicitor invited Mr. Evely Nash to meet him, and he dropped the hint which gave the opening for overtures by saying something about my niece. "Then you," said Mr. Nash, "must be the Archduke John of Tuscany." "I am," replied the mysterious stranger, and then the conversation turned on literary matters. "I can't write my life under my own name," said the stranger, "but if you want reminiscences of the House of Habsburg, I can provide you with plenty of them." There, for the moment, the matter was left, but presently there was a sequel. Information was received that the same traveler had also visited Paris, and there also had been invited to a little dinner in a restaurant. But in Paris, the inquiry into his representations was pursued more carefully. Princess Louise of Saxe-Coburg, who was then in Paris and who had known John of Tuscany well, consented to come to the restaurant and look at the stranger, without making herself known to him. He did not recognize her, and she did not recognize him. "That man," she said, "is no more John of Tuscany than I am." And when Mr. Nash subsequently tried to get into communication with his mysterious acquaintance at the address which had been given to him, his letter was returned to him. So that identification falls to the ground, and indeed, the plausibility of the most plausible of the identifications weighs but little in the balance when set against the difficulty of vanishing, as John Orth is supposed to have vanished from human ken. What Jabez Balfour failed to do in the same part of the world, with considerably stronger motives for doing it, John Orth is not in the least likely to have done. Nor need his melodramatic exit speeches, if he really delivered them, influence our judgment in the matter. For there is nothing in a determination to die without dying which can avail to save a sailor from the perils of the sea. Nor is anything proved by the fact that John Orth's mother, believing one or other of the stories, suddenly ceased to wear mourning for her son. Her case, in that respect, was only like that of the mother of Sir Roger Tichborne, and, like the mother of Sir Roger Tichborne, she gave large sums of money to an impostor who claimed to be her son. So we may take it as proved beyond all reasonable doubt that John Orth is really and truly dead, and the law courts recently took that view and gave leave to presume his death to the advantage of his heirs. His death is the second of the major tragedies of Francis Joseph's reign. The assassination of the Empress was to be the third.
This concludes today's reading of the life of the Emperor Francis Joseph, by Francis Gribble. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.